They were told Americans would shoot German medical staff on sight. No questions, no mercy, just bullets. But when Nurse Greta Hoffman stood frozen in the ruins of a Bavarian field hospital on April 28, 1945, watching U.S. soldiers burst through the shattered doors, the enemy did not raise their rifles. Instead, a young American sergeant with blood soaking his uniform locked eyes with her and said 3 words that would change everything. Please help him. She expected death. She got a choice. The field hospital sat on the edge of a small Bavarian town called Pfaffenhofen, nestled between rolling hills that had once been green but were now scarred with tank tracks and artillery craters. The building had been a schoolhouse before the war, its cheerful yellow paint now blackened by smoke and peeling in long strips. Windows were blown out, replaced by crude wooden boards. The red cross painted on the roof was faded and bullet-pocked, a symbol that had offered no real protection in the final chaotic weeks of the war. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, blood, and decay. The April morning light filtered weakly through broken windows, casting pale shadows across rows of wounded German soldiers lying on makeshift cots. Some moaned softly, others stared at the ceiling in silence, their faces gray with pain and exhaustion. The floor was sticky with dried blood, and the walls were lined with shelves that had once held textbooks but now held bandages, morphine vials, and surgical instruments sterilized in boiling water over a wood stove. Greta Hoffman, 26 years old, moved between the wounded men with practiced efficiency. Her nurse's uniform was stained and threadbare, her once white apron now a patchwork of brown and rust-colored stains that no amount of washing could remove. Her blonde hair, which regulations said should be pinned neatly beneath her cap, hung loose in places, escaping from pins lost days ago. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes. She had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in 2 weeks. The sound came first, a low rumble that grew steadily louder, shaking dust from the ceiling beams. The wounded men stirred, fear flickering across their faces. They knew that sound. Tanks. But whose? Then came the sharper crack of rifle fire, distant but getting closer. The battle for the town had been raging since dawn, German forces desperately trying to hold a position that everyone knew was already lost. The Third Reich was collapsing, its armies fragmenting, but orders still came down to fight to the last man. Greta's hands trembled as she tried to change a bandage on a young soldier's shattered leg. The boy could not have been older than 18, his face smooth and boyish beneath the grime. He gripped her wrist, his eyes wide. "They will kill us all when they come, yes?" he whispered in German. "The Americans?" Before Greta could answer, the sound of engines grew deafening. Brakes squealed outside. Boots hit the ground, dozens of them running. Shouted commands in English echoed off the buildings. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite drifted through the broken windows, mixing with the hospital's grim odors. The heavy wooden doors at the entrance burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. Bright daylight flooded the dim room, and silhouetted against it were American soldiers, rifles raised, helmets shadowing their faces. Greta froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. Every muscle in her body locked. This was the moment she had been warned about, the moment that had haunted her nightmares for weeks. The Nazis had told them again and again, "The Americans take no prisoners when they find German medical staff. They consider you collaborators. They will line you up against the wall." Around her, the wounded German soldiers who could move tried to sit up, hands raised in surrender. Some cried out. One elderly doctor, Dr. Klein, stepped forward with his hands up, speaking rapidly in broken English. "We are medical. Geneva Convention. We have wounded only." The American soldiers swept through the room with practiced efficiency, rifles moving from corner to corner, checking for threats. They were young men, most of them, with hard eyes and dirt-streaked faces. Their uniforms were combat-worn, spotted with mud and who knew what else. They moved like men who had seen too much death and expected more at any moment. Greta's mind raced. She had worked in military hospitals since 1942, had seen countless wounded men, had held boys' hands as they died far from home. She had never been political, never cared about the Reich's grand visions. She had only wanted to help, to heal, to do something good in a world that seemed to be tearing itself apart. And now it had come to this, standing in a room full of dying men, waiting for a bullet. But the bullets did not come. The sergeant who entered next was different from the others. He was older, maybe 30, with a weathered face and sergeant's stripes on his dusty uniform. But what caught Greta's attention was the blood. It soaked his left side, dark and wet, spreading across his shirt beneath his unbuttoned jacket. He moved stiffly, one arm pressed against his ribs, his face pale beneath his helmet. Behind him, 2 soldiers half carried, half dragged another American. This man was unconscious, his head lolling, blood streaming from a wound in his shoulder and chest. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Even from across the room, Greta could see he was in bad shape. Very bad shape. The sergeant's eyes swept the room and locked onto Greta. She stood out because she was the only woman, the only one in a nurse's uniform. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the chaos of the room. His eyes were brown, she noticed. Hard, but not cruel. Exhausted, but not defeated. He took 3 steps toward her, wincing with each movement. His men tensed, rifles ready, watching for any threat. The sergeant stopped 5 feet away from Greta, close enough that she could see the sweat on his face, the 3-day stubble on his jaw, the way his hand shook slightly as he pressed it against his wounded side. "You," he said in English, his voice rough. "You're a nurse." It was not a question, but Greta nodded anyway, her throat too tight to speak. The sergeant gestured toward the man his soldiers had carried in, now laying on the floor just inside the doorway. "Help him," the sergeant said. Then he paused, and something changed in his face. The hardness softened just a fraction. "Please help him." Greta stood frozen. Her mind could not process what was happening. This was wrong. This was not how it was supposed to go. The enemy was supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to kill her, not ask for her help. Not say please. "Please," the sergeant said again, and this time there was desperation in his voice. "Private Henderson has a wife. 2 little girls. He has been hit bad. Our medic is dead. Please." Something broke inside Greta. Perhaps it was the word please. Perhaps it was the mention of little girls. Perhaps it was simply that after 3 years of war, after 3 years of seeing boys die in agony, she could not stand to see another one die when she might be able to help. She found her voice. I do not speak English well." "You speak it fine," the sergeant said. "Better than my German? Will you help him?" Greta looked at Dr. Klein, the elderly German physician who stood nearby with his hands still raised. He gave her a tiny nod. Then she looked at the wounded American soldier on the floor, at the blood pooling beneath him, at his chest barely rising and falling. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes. Bring him to the table." The sergeant sagged with relief. He barked orders in English to his men, and they carefully lifted the wounded soldier and carried him to the examination table in the center of the room, sweeping aside instruments and bandages. Greta moved quickly now, her training taking over, pushing aside fear and confusion. As Greta approached the table, she was acutely aware of the American soldiers watching her every move. Their rifles were no longer pointed at her, but they held them ready. They did not trust her. Why would they? She was the enemy. She looked down at the wounded soldier, Private Henderson. He was young, maybe 22 or 23. Dark hair, a square jaw, freckles across his nose. His uniform had been cut away from the wound, revealing a ragged hole in his upper chest near his shoulder. The bullet had gone through. She could see the exit wound in his back, larger and messier. Blood welled up with each shallow breath. Lung damage, certainly, possibly worse. "I need to stop the bleeding," Greta said, forcing herself to speak clearly despite her accent. She pointed to a cabinet. "In there, gauze, bandages, and morphine. He needs morphine." The sergeant nodded to one of his men, who moved to the cabinet. "Show him which ones," the sergeant said. Greta walked to the cabinet, very aware that soldiers tracked her with their weapons. She pulled out what she needed: rolls of gauze, a bottle of iodine, a precious vial of morphine, needles. Her hands were steadier now. This was familiar. This was what she knew how to do. When she returned to the table, she injected the morphine first. Private Henderson did not even flinch. He was too far gone. That was bad. She pressed gauze pads to both the entry and exit wounds, applying pressure. Blood soaked through immediately. "I need help," she said, looking up at the sergeant. "Someone must hold pressure here while I prepare to clean and stitch." The sergeant stepped forward without hesitation, pressing his own hands over hers on the wound. His hands were large, calloused, soldier's hands, but they were gentle enough. Greta felt the warmth of them, the steadiness. She pulled her hands away and quickly prepared her instruments, cleaning them in alcohol. "What is your name?" the sergeant asked suddenly. Greta glanced up, surprised. Greta Hoffman." "Sergeant Michael Reilly," he said. "Boston. That is Private James Henderson. Oklahoma. He has been with us since Normandy. He is a good kid." Greta did not know why he was telling her this. Perhaps to remind her that this bleeding man on the table was not just an enemy soldier, but a person. A man with a home, a family, a story. As if she needed reminding. She had learned that lesson with the first German boy who died in her arms. "I will do what I can," she said quietly. She worked quickly, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Clean the wound. Check for debris. The bullet had cracked the collarbone but missed the major arteries. That was lucky. But the lung was damaged. Air bubbled in the blood. She packed the wound carefully, stitched what could be stitched, bandaged tightly to seal the chest. Around her, the American soldiers watched in tense silence. Private Henderson's breathing steadied slightly. His color was still terrible, gray and waxy, but the immediate bleeding had stopped. He needed a hospital, a real hospital with surgeons and blood transfusions and antibiotics. But for now he would live. Probably. Greta stepped back, her hands covered in blood. American blood now, not German. Was there even a difference? It looked the same. It smelled the same. He needs rest, she said, and more morphine when he wakes, and penicillin if you have it. The wound will infect otherwise. Sergeant Reilly nodded. He was looking at her differently now, she realized. Not as an enemy, not quite as a friend, but as something in between. Thank you, he said simply. Greta did not know how to respond. She nodded and turned to wash her hands in a basin of water that had gone pink with blood. As Greta dried her hands, she turned back to see Sergeant Reilly leaning heavily against the table, his face even paler than before. His hand was still pressed against his side, and fresh blood had seeped through his fingers. You are wounded, Greta said, stating the obvious. It is nothing, Reilly said, but his voice was tight with pain. It is not nothing, Greta said firmly. For a moment she forgot he was the enemy, forgot she was supposed to be afraid. She was a nurse, and he was wounded, and that was all that mattered. Sit down, let me see. Reilly hesitated, then nodded to his men. They lowered their rifles slightly, but remained alert. He moved to a chair and sat heavily, unbuttoning his jacket and shirt with clumsy fingers. When he pulled the fabric aside, Greta could see the wound. A deep gash along his ribs, not a bullet, but shrapnel probably. It was bleeding steadily, but not dangerously. It would need stitches. This will hurt, Greta warned. I have had worse, Reilly said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. Greta cleaned the wound, her touch as gentle as she could make it. Reilly tensed, but did not cry out. She stitched quickly, her fingers sure despite the surreal situation. Here she was, a German nurse, sewing up an American sergeant in a field hospital while soldiers from both sides watched. Why did you do that? Reilly asked suddenly. Why did you help Henderson? Greta paused in her stitching, then continued. He was dying. I am a nurse. It is what I do. But we are the enemy. Greta looked up at him, meeting his eyes. Are we? I am a nurse. He is a wounded man. Where is the enemy in that? Reilly stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition. You are not what they told us German medical staff would be like. No? Greta tied off the last stitch. And what did they tell you? That you would be Nazis, true believers, that you would spit on us, refuse to help, maybe try to kill us. Greta reached for a bandage. I am not a Nazi. I am a nurse. I joined because I wanted to help people, not because I believed in Hitler's war. She pressed the bandage against his side, taping it in place. There. Done. You need rest and clean bandages tomorrow. Try not to move too much. Reilly stood slowly, testing his movement. Thank you, Greta Hoffman. It was the first time an enemy soldier had said her name with something like respect. The immediate crisis over, an awkward silence filled the room. American soldiers stood guard while German wounded lay in their cots, watching with fearful eyes. Two groups of enemies, forced together by circumstance, neither quite sure what to do next. Dr. Klein broke the silence, speaking to Sergeant Reilly in careful English. We have 32 wounded German soldiers here. Some are critical. They need care. What will you do with us? Reilly looked around the room, his jaw tight. Greta could see the conflict in his face. These were enemy soldiers, men who had shot at him and his friends, men whose comrades had killed Americans. But they were also wounded, helpless, no longer a threat. We will secure the building, Reilly said finally. My men will guard it, but your wounded will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. We are not barbarians. Relief flooded Dr. Klein's face. Thank you. Thank you. But you all stay here, Reilly added firmly. No one leaves, no one tries anything stupid. Understood? Understood, Dr. Klein said quickly. Reilly turned to Greta. Miss Hoffman, we have more wounded coming in. More Americans. There was heavy fighting in the town. Our aid station got hit. We need help. Will you and your doctor continue treating the wounded? All of the wounded? Greta glanced at the German soldiers in their cots, then at Private Henderson lying unconscious on the table, then back at Reilly. The choice was both simple and impossible. She could refuse, could say she would only treat German soldiers. But that would be a lie. She had already crossed that line when she helped Henderson. And the truth was, she could not stand by and watch anyone die if she had the power to help. Yes, she said, we will help. Over the next hour, more wounded Americans were brought in. Some walked with help, others were carried on stretchers. They had been caught in a mortar attack. Shrapnel wounds, broken bones, one man with a piece of metal lodged in his abdomen that Greta did not think she could save, but she tried anyway. The small field hospital became a strange place that afternoon. German nurses and doctors worked alongside American medics who had survived the attack. German wounded lay in cots next to American wounded. Both sides watched each other with suspicion and curiosity and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Greta moved from patient to patient, treating injuries without seeing uniforms. A shattered ankle on a boy from Iowa, a burned hand on a soldier from Cologne, a head wound on a sergeant from Texas, a bullet graze on a boy from Munich. Pain was pain, blood was blood, suffering was suffering. She was bandaging the Iowa boy's ankle when he spoke to her in halting textbook German. "Denke," he said. "Thank you." Greta looked up, surprised. "Your German is good." He smiled weakly. "My grandmother was from Hamburg. She taught me." "Then you have family in Germany?" "Had," he said, his smile fading. "The bombing. We do not know who survived." Greta nodded, understanding. "I am sorry." "Me too," he said. "I am sorry about all of it." Greta finished his bandage in silence, her throat tight with emotion she could not quite name. The field hospital settled into an uneasy routine over the following days. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. German resistance in the area had collapsed. American forces controlled the town and the surrounding countryside, but the wounded still needed care, and so the strange arrangement continued. Each morning Greta woke in the small room behind the hospital where the nurses slept. There were 3 of them: Greta, another nurse named Hilda who was 50 and motherly, and a young trainee named Anna who was barely 19 and had only started nursing 6 months ago. They woke to the sound of American sentries changing guard outside, boots crunching on gravel, voices calling out passwords in English. They would wash their faces in cold water from a pump, pin their hair, and put on their stained uniforms. Then they would enter the main ward and begin the day's work. The Americans had brought supplies, real supplies. Fresh bandages, not the torn sheets they had been using. Morphine, plenty of it. Sulfa powder to fight infection. Plasma for transfusions. Even coffee, real coffee, which Greta had not tasted in 2 years. Sergeant Reilly had remained in charge of the hospital guard. His wound was healing well. He supervised the security but also helped where he could, translating, moving supplies, keeping peace between German and American soldiers who eyed each other with lingering hostility. The daily routine went like this. Morning rounds at 7. Greta and Dr. Klein would check every patient, German and American alike. Change bandages, administer medication, check for signs of infection, which was always the killer in these conditions. The Americans had penicillin, which was like a miracle. Greta had only read about it. Now she saw it save lives that would have been lost. Breakfast came at 8. The Americans shared their rations: canned hash, crackers, chocolate bars. The Germans ate hesitantly at first, suspecting some kind of trick or test, but hunger won over suspicion. The food was bland but plentiful, more than they had seen in months. Work continued through the day. New wounded still arrived occasionally, though less frequently as the fighting moved elsewhere. Greta found herself working alongside an American medic named Thompson, a quiet man from Kansas who showed her how to apply the new plasma transfusions and how to properly use sulfa powder. They communicated in a mixture of English, German, and hand gestures. It should have been awkward. It was at first, but necessity and shared purpose created a kind of understanding. When Thompson could not find a vein for an IV, Greta would step in with her smaller, steadier hands. When Greta struggled to lift a heavy patient, Thompson would help without being asked. Lunch was at noon, dinner at 6. In between there was the endless work of caring for the wounded, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lines between sides began to blur. Sergeant Reilly spent much of his time in the hospital. Officially, he was there to maintain security and coordinate with headquarters. Unofficially, Greta thought he stayed because he had nowhere else to be. His unit had moved on to chase the retreating German forces. He had been left behind because of his wound, tasked with managing this strange pocket of peace in the middle of a war. They talked sometimes, usually late at night when the day's work was done and the wounded were sleeping. Greta would be making final rounds, checking bandages by lamplight. Reilly would be sitting at a desk near the door, writing reports or reading letters from home. "How is Henderson doing?" Reilly asked one evening, 3 days after the Americans had arrived. Greta had just finished checking on the young private. "Better, the lung is healing. He will recover, I think. But he needs to be evacuated to a real hospital soon." "Transport is coming tomorrow," Reilly said. "We are moving the worst cases back to field hospitals in the rear. Henderson will go. Some of your German patients too, actually, the ones who can be moved." Greta nodded. "That is good. They will get better care than I can provide here." "You have done well with what you have," Reilly said. "Better than well. You saved Henderson's life. The docs at the field hospital said so. They said if you had not stopped the bleeding when you did, he would have died before they could have gotten him there." Greta felt a strange warmth at the praise. "I only did what any nurse would do." "No," Reilly said, leaning back in his chair. "Not any nurse. Some nurses would have let him die. He was the enemy. You could have done nothing and no one would have blamed you. Hell, some people would have called it patriotic." "Those people know nothing about medicine," Greta said quietly. "When you take an oath to heal, it does not come with exceptions." Reilly studied her for a long moment. "You really believe that?" "Of course. Do you not?" "I do now," he said. "But I did not when I walked through that door 5 days ago. I thought you would all be monsters. That is what they told us. That is what we believed." Greta sat down in a chair across from him, suddenly tired. And we were told the Americans were monsters too. That you would torture prisoners, execute medical staff, commit atrocities. I was so frightened when you came through that door, I thought I would die." "I am glad you did not," Reilly said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Greta asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you ask me to help Henderson? You could have ordered me. You had the guns. Why did you say please?" Reilly considered this. "Because my mother raised me to have manners, I guess. And because I needed you to want to help, not just obey orders. Medicine does not work when you are doing it because someone has a gun on you. It works when you care." "You are not like other soldiers I have seen," Greta said. "That is funny," Reilly said with a slight smile. "I was thinking the same about you. You are not like the Nazis we were told to expect." "I am not a Nazi," Greta said firmly. "I never was. I am a nurse. I wanted to help people, not serve Hitler." "Then why did you join?" Greta hesitated, then decided honesty was the only option. "Because I had no choice. In 1942, all nurses were required to serve. If you refused, you could be arrested. And I thought at least in a hospital I could do some good. Save some lives. Make some meaning out of the madness." Reilly nodded slowly. "I get that. I joined because of Pearl Harbor. I was angry. I wanted revenge. But after Normandy, after watching my friends die in the surf, after months of fighting, I do not know what I want anymore. Just for it to end, I guess." "It is ending," Greta said. "The radio says the Reich is finished. Hitler is dead. It is only a matter of days now." "Yeah," Reilly said. "Days. And then what?" "Then we try to build something better," Greta said. "If they let us." "They will," Reilly said. "It will not be easy. There will be trials, punishment for the guilty. But regular people like you will be okay. I will make sure of it." Greta looked at him in surprise. "Why would you do that?" "Because you saved Henderson's life. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I have seen enough death. I would like to help preserve some life for a change." Something shifted between them in that moment. A barrier fell. They were no longer quite enemies. Not quite friends. But something in between. Something new. The wounded men noticed the change too. At first, German and American patients had eyed each other with suspicion and hostility. They lay in cots separated by an invisible line, neither side speaking to the other. But slowly that changed. It started with small things. An American soldier named Davis, who had lost his left hand to shrapnel, dropped his water cup. It rolled across the floor and stopped near a German soldier's cot. The German, a young man named Klaus with both legs in casts, reached down and picked it up. He held it out to Davis without a word. Davis stared at it for a moment, then took it. "Danke," he said in terrible German. Klaus smiled despite himself. "Bitte." Later that same day, a German soldier named Friedrich, who could walk with crutches, brought a blanket to an American who was shivering with fever. The American looked up in surprise. "Thanks, pal," he mumbled. Friedrich did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded and moved on. These tiny moments of humanity accumulated. Greta watched them with a mixture of hope and sadness. This is what it could have been, she thought. If the madmen had not started this war, if ordinary people had been allowed to simply be human to each other, how many lives could have been saved? One afternoon, Greta was changing bandages on a German officer, a captain named Weber who had been shot in the stomach. He was in his 40s, older than most soldiers, with graying hair and a tired face. He spoke English well, having studied in London before the war. In the cot next to him lay Private First Class Martinez, an American from New Mexico with a shattered collarbone. Martinez had been watching Weber with suspicion for days. "You are an officer," Martinez said suddenly, breaking the silence. Weber glanced over. "I was. That does not seem to matter much now." "You give orders? Send men to fight?" "Yes," Weber said simply. "I did my duty as I saw it, as you did yours, I imagine." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "My brother died at the Bulge. German officers sent tanks against us in the snow. He froze to death in a foxhole." Weber met his eyes steadily. "I am sorry for your loss. I have lost 2 brothers in this war. One in Russia, one in France. War makes orphans and widows of us all." "That is supposed to make it okay?" Martinez asked, anger in his voice. "No," Weber said. "Nothing makes it okay. But hating each other now will not bring back the dead. It will only make more." Martinez stared at the ceiling, jaw tight. Then quietly, "I do not know how to stop hating." "Neither do I," Weber admitted. "But perhaps we can try." Greta finished Weber's bandages and moved on, but she carried that conversation with her. Perhaps we can try. It was not much, but it was something. The most surprising friendship developed between Private Henderson, recovering well now, and a young German soldier named Otto. Otto was only 17, had been drafted in the final desperate months of the ESU war, and had been shot in the first battle he ever fought. Henderson could not speak German. Otto could not speak English. But they were both young, both scared, both a long way from home. They communicated through drawings and gestures. Otto would sketch pictures of his farm in Bavaria. Henderson would show photographs of his daughters he kept in his pocket. One evening, Greta found them playing cards, using a battered deck that Henderson had produced from somewhere. They were playing completely by gestures, making up rules as they went along, laughing at their misunderstandings. Two boys who should have been enemies, acting like boys for perhaps the first time in years. Small rituals developed. Every evening, Hilda, the older German nurse, would make a weak tea from herbs she had gathered from the hospital garden. She would serve it to everyone, German and American alike, in mismatched cups. The Americans called it mystery tea, and joked about its strange taste, but they drank it anyway. It became a moment of peace, a pause in the day where everyone could rest. Music helped too. One of the American soldiers had a harmonica. His name was Collins, and he had a shrapnel wound in his thigh that was healing slowly. In the evenings, he would play simple tunes. American folk songs at first, but then someone requested Lily Marlene, the song that both German and Allied soldiers had loved during the war. Collins played it, and the Germans sang along softly in German while the Americans listened. There was something deeply moving about it. Here were enemies singing the same song, sharing the same sadness, missing the same things. Home, peace, normal life. Greta noticed that Sergeant Reilly always stopped his work when Collins played. He would stand near the door, arms crossed, eyes distant. One evening she approached him during the music. "Does it remind you of something?" she asked quietly. "My kid brother played harmonica," Reilly said without looking at her. "He was at Anzio, killed in the landing." "I am sorry," Greta said, meaning it. "Me too." He was quiet for a moment, then. He was 19. Never got to see Rome. Never got to go home. Never got to do anything but die on a beach. Greta did not know what to say to that. There were no words that could make that kind of loss better, so she just stood beside him, listening to the harmonica, sharing the silence and the sorrow. Another evening, young Anna, the trainee nurse, celebrated her 20th birthday. The Americans found out somehow, and they produced a cake. Not a real cake, but something made from ration crackers and canned frosting that one of them had received in a care package. It looked terrible and probably tasted worse. But when they presented it to Anna, who burst into tears, it did not matter. Everyone gathered around, German and American, and sang happy birthday in both languages. Anna could not stop crying. She told Greta later that it was the kindness that had broken her. "I expected them to be cruel," she sobbed. "I prepared myself for cruelty, but this is harder. This makes me feel human again, and I do not know if I deserve that." "Everyone deserves kindness," Greta told her, holding the young girl as she cried. "Everyone deserves to feel human. That is what this war took from us. Maybe we can take it back." Food was shared, stories were exchanged, and gradually the hospital became less of a battlefield and more of a strange, temporary family. Not everyone participated. Some German soldiers remained bitter and hostile. Some American soldiers refused to see the Germans as anything but enemies. But enough people on both sides chose humanity over hatred that the atmosphere changed. Dr. Klein described it best one evening when he and Greta were reviewing supplies. "What we have created here is a small miracle," he said in German. "A place where the war has stopped, even though it rages everywhere else. It cannot last, of course, but while it does, it is precious." He was right. It was precious and fragile, and it would not last. Late at night, when the patients were sleeping and her work was done, Greta would sit in the nurse's room and try to understand what was happening to her. She had been raised to believe certain things, that Germany was strong and proud, that its enemies were evil and jealous of German greatness, that the war, however difficult, was necessary to secure Germany's future. She had never been a Nazi true believer, had never attended the rallies or believed the wildest propaganda. But some of it had seeped in despite her resistance, like water through a crack in stone. Americans were supposed to be soft, weak, controlled by Jews and communists. They were supposed to be cowards and brutes, somehow both at once. They were supposed to be the enemy, not just of Germany, but of civilization itself. But the Americans she had met were just men. Young men far from home, frightened and brave, cruel and kind, no different really from the German soldiers she had been treating for years. They missed their mothers. They carried photographs of sweethearts. They cried out for home when the pain was bad. They bled the same red blood. Sergeant Reilly was not a monster. He was a tired man trying to do his duty with some degree of decency. Private Henderson was not a demon. He was a father who wanted to see his daughters again. Thompson, the medic, was not a barbarian. He was a farmer from Kansas who showed her pictures of his fields and talked about how he wanted to grow wheat again when the war ended. The dissonance tore at Greta. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make her? She had served the Reich for 3 years. She had healed German soldiers so they could return to fight. She had done nothing to resist or protest. Did that make her guilty? Was she a collaborator in atrocities she had never witnessed but must have known were happening? She thought of the rumors that had circulated for years. Camps in the East, disappearances, Jewish families rounded up and sent away. She had not wanted to believe them. It was easier not to believe, easier to focus on her work, to tell herself she was just healing the wounded, that medicine was separate from politics. But was it? Could it be? When the wounded you healed went back to fight for evil, were you not part of that evil? These thoughts chased each other around her head in the dark hours of the night, giving her no peace. She had no answers, only questions and guilt and confusion. One night she could not bear it anymore. She found Sergeant Reilly sitting at his usual post by the door, reading a letter from home by lamplight. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly, so as not to wake the sleepers. "Sure," Reilly said, putting the letter aside. Greta sat down, struggling to find the words. "What will happen to us? To German nurses, doctors, people like me? When the war ends?" Reilly studied her face. "That depends. There will be investigations. The SS, the Gestapo, camp guards, people who committed atrocities, they will be tried and punished. But medical staff who just did their jobs, who treated wounded soldiers, I cannot imagine they will be treated as war criminals. Even though we served the Reich, you did not have a choice. You told me yourself. You were conscripted, and you treated the wounded, which is protected under the Geneva Convention. That is not a crime. But I healed soldiers who went back to fight, who killed American soldiers, maybe even your friends. Does that not make me responsible?" Reilly was quiet for a long moment. By that logic, every American medic is responsible for every German soldier killed by Americans they saved. Every nurse on every side is guilty. That is not how it works. You are a medical professional doing your duty. There is no guilt in healing. "Then why do I feel so guilty?" Greta asked, her voice breaking. Reilly leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Because you are a good person. Bad people do not feel guilty. They justify everything they do. The fact that you question yourself, that you feel the weight of this, that is proof that you are not a monster. How can you be so sure? Because I have seen you work. I have seen how you treat the wounded, all of the wounded, with the same care. I have seen you sit with men while they die, holding their hands, German and American alike. I have seen you cry when you cannot save someone. Monsters do not cry for their enemies." Greta felt tears in her eyes. "I am so tired of death. I am so tired of this war. I just want it to be over." "It will be soon," Reilly said gently. "A few more days, maybe a week, and then we all have to figure out how to live with what we have done and what has been done to us. How do we do that?" "I do not know," Reilly admitted. "But I think it starts with moments like this. Enemies talking to each other like people, building something better from the ruins." Greta wiped her eyes. "Thank you. For being kind. You did not have to be." "Neither did you," Reilly said. "But you were anyway. That is why I know you will be okay." It was not absolution. Greta knew she would carry the questions and the guilt for the rest of her life, but it was something. A small light in the darkness. The American soldiers were going through their own transformation. They had arrived at the hospital expecting hardened Nazis, cruel medical staff who would need to be subdued by force. What they found instead was a handful of exhausted nurses and an old doctor trying to keep wounded men alive with almost no supplies. Private Davis, the soldier who had lost his hand, spent a lot of time watching Greta work. One evening he spoke to Sergeant Reilly about it. "Sarge, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," Reilly said. "The German nurse, Greta. She is not what I expected." "No," Reilly agreed. "She is not. I mean, I thought all Germans were—" Davis struggled to find the words. "I thought they all believed in Hitler, that they all wanted to kill us. But she saved Henderson. She's been taking care of all of us, better than we probably deserve. I do not understand it." Reilly considered his response carefully. "What you thought was propaganda, Davis. We all believed it because it made things simpler. Clear good guys and bad guys. But real life is more complicated. Most people are just trying to survive, trying to do what they think is right. Greta is a nurse who wanted to heal people. The fact that she is German does not change that." "So what do we do with that?" Davis asked. How do we hate them if they are just regular people? We do not hate them, Reilly said. We hold the leaders accountable for the war. We hold individuals accountable for atrocities. But regular people caught up in the machine? We show them mercy and hope they learn from it. Davis nodded slowly. My sister is a nurse back home in Oregon. I keep thinking about that. If the war had gone different, if the Germans had invaded America, she would have been exactly like Greta, just trying to help the wounded no matter which side they were on. Exactly, Reilly said. Thompson, the medic from Kansas, had his own revelation. He had been working closely with Greta for days, teaching her about American medical techniques while she showed him tricks she had learned through years of battlefield medicine. One afternoon, while they were changing bandages on a German soldier with infected wounds, Thompson said something in English that Greta did not quite catch. Sorry, he said, switching to his broken German. I was just thinking. You are really good at this. The medicine, I mean. You are better at some things than our doctors. Greta shrugged, embarrassed. I have had much practice. Too much practice. No, I mean it, Thompson insisted. The way you can find veins, the way you stabilize chest wounds, the way you can tell just by looking if an infection is going septic, that is skill, not just practice. You should teach after the war, at a real hospital or a medical school. I do not think anyone would want a German to teach them anything, Greta said bitterly. Not after what we have done. What have you done? Thompson asked. You healed people, that is all. If I was wounded, I would want someone with your skills treating me, no matter where they were from. It was a small comment, casually said, but it lodged in Greta's heart like a splinter. Maybe she had not ruined her whole life by being on the wrong side. Maybe there could be a future beyond the war. The biggest change came from Private Henderson himself. When he woke from his fevered unconsciousness 3 days after surgery, the first thing he saw was Greta checking his bandages. Who are you? He asked weakly. I am Greta, she said in careful English. I am your nurse. Henderson's eyes went wide as he registered her accent. You are German. Yes. He looked confused, frightened. Why are you helping me? Because you needed help, Greta said simply. How do you feel? Any pain in your chest? Henderson stared at her for a long moment. Then quietly, thank you. Over the following days, as Henderson recovered strength, he and Greta talked often. He told her about his wife, Mary, and his daughters, little Alice, who was 5, and baby Emma, who was not yet 2. He showed Greta their photographs, worn and creased from being carried in his pocket. I was so scared I would never see them again, Henderson admitted. When I got hit, all I could think was that my girls would grow up without a father, that I would never get to hold them again. But you will, Greta said. You are healing well. You will go home. Because of you, Henderson said. Sergeant Reilly told me. He said you saved my life when I was bleeding out. You did not have to do that. I am the enemy. You are a wounded man and a father, Greta corrected gently. That is all I saw. Henderson was quiet, absorbing this. My wife is a school teacher. She teaches kids about doing the right thing, about helping others even when it is hard. I think she would like you. It was perhaps the greatest compliment anyone had ever paid Greta. A few days later, when Henderson was being prepared for evacuation to a rear hospital, he asked Greta to write her name on a piece of paper. I want to remember you, he said. I want to tell my daughters about the German nurse who saved their daddy's life. I want them to know that even in war, people can choose kindness. Greta wrote her name with trembling hands. Greta Hoffman, she wrote. German Red Cross nurse. Pfaffenhofen Field Hospital, April 1945. Henderson folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket with his family photographs. Thank you, he said again, for everything. You are welcome, Greta said. Go home to your daughters. Be well. As they carried Henderson out to the ambulance, Greta felt something shift inside her. She had spent years of this war feeling helpless, powerless to stop the suffering. But she had saved this one man. She had sent him home to his family. It was a tiny victory in an ocean of loss, but it was hers. The transformation happening in the small field hospital existed in a bubble, separate from the wider world. But that bubble could not last forever. One morning, a week after the Americans had arrived, a military vehicle pulled up to the hospital. An officer got out, a major with a grim expression and something dark in his eyes. He spoke with Sergeant Reilly for a long time in low tones. Greta could not hear what they said, but she saw Reilly's face go pale, saw his jaw tighten with barely controlled rage. After the major left, Reilly was different, colder. He avoided eye contact with the German staff. When he had to speak to them, his voice was clipped and professional, stripped of the warmth that had been growing there. That evening, Greta found him sitting outside, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. She almost walked away, sensing he wanted to be alone. But something made her approach. What is wrong? She asked. Reilly did not look at her. "You should go inside, Miss Hoffman. Please, tell me what happened." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, "They found a camp, about 60 miles from here. Not a prisoner of war camp. Something else. The major showed me photographs." Greta felt ice in her stomach. "What kind of camp?" "The kind where they murdered people. Thousands of people. Jews, mostly. But also political prisoners, disabled people, anyone the Nazis decided was not worth living. They starved them, worked them to death, executed them. The photographs..." His voice broke. "Bodies piled like firewood, walking skeletons. Children, Greta. Dead children." Greta wanted to say this was impossible, that it could not be true, that Germany would not do such things, but she could not. Because deep down she had known. They had all known. The rumors, the disappearances, the train cars that came back empty, they had known and they had chosen not to see. "I did not know," she whispered. "I swear I did not know." "Did not know or did not want to know?" Reilly asked, and there was accusation in his voice now. "How could you not know? It was your country, your government." "I am a nurse," Greta said desperately. "I was in field hospitals. I treated wounded soldiers. I never went to those camps. I never saw..." "But you heard rumors. You must have heard something." Greta felt tears streaming down her face. Yes, I heard rumors. About camps in the East. About Jews being sent away. But I told myself it could not be as bad as people said. That it was just wartime stories, exaggerated. I wanted to believe that we were better than that." "But you were not," Reilly said flatly. "Your country did this. And everyone who served it, everyone who looked the away, everyone who just focused on their jobs and did not ask questions. You are all responsible." The words hit Greta like physical blows. Because he was right. She had been complicit through her silence, through her willingness to serve without questioning. She had. Told herself she was just healing people, just doing good in a bad situation. But she had been part of the machine that enabled the horror. "I am sorry," she choked out. "I am so sorry." "Sorry does not bring back the dead," Reilly said. He threw a cigarette down and crushed it under his boot. "I need to think. I cannot look at you right now and not see those photographs." He walked away, leaving Greta standing alone in the darkness, crying silently. That night was the longest of Greta's life. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the images Reilly had described. Dead children, bodies piled like wood, walking skeletons, and she heard her own voice making excuses, saying she did not know, when the truth was she had chosen not to know because knowing would have required her to make impossible choices. The next morning, the atmosphere in the hospital was different. The Americans were colder, more distant. The bubble of humanity they had created was punctured. The horror of the wider war had intruded, and it could not be ignored. But the work continued. The wounded still needed care. And Greta discovered something in those dark days. Redemption did not come through words or apologies. It came through actions. She could not change the past. She could not bring back the dead, but she could save the lives in front of her, one at a time. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. Every patient she saved, German or American, was a small act of defiance against the death that had consumed her country. Every wound she cleaned, every infection she fought, every moment she spent preserving life was her answer to the horror. The crisis came 2 days later. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. A truck screeched to a halt in front of the hospital, and soldiers jumped out carrying wounded men. But these were not combat casualties. These were prisoners, German soldiers captured in the final fighting. They had been marching to a POW camp when one of them had attacked a guard. In the chaos that followed, several prisoners had been shot. The American guards brought in 4 wounded German prisoners. They were in bad shape, bleeding heavily, and the Americans made clear they expected Greta and the German medical staff to treat them. But there was a problem. Greta recognized 2 of the wounded men. One was SS, the distinctive tattoo under his arm visible when they stripped off his uniform. The other she recognized from months ago, before the field hospital, when she had worked at a military hospital further east. He had been Gestapo, she was certain. She remembered him because he had come to the hospital to interrogate a wounded soldier suspected of desertion, and she had watched him beat the terrified boy despite his injuries. Now this Gestapo man lay bleeding from a stomach wound, crying out in pain, begging for help. The SS trooper was unconscious, a bullet in his chest. Greta stood frozen. These were the men who had created the horror. These were the true believers, the enforcers of the Reich's cruelest policies. They were the ones who had run the camps, who had pulled triggers, who had turned their country into a charnel house. Every fiber of her being screamed not to help them, to let them die, to say it was justice, retribution for the thousands they had murdered. The American guards watched her, their faces hard. They did not order her to help. They just waited to see what she would do. Greta looked at Dr. Klein. He looked back at her, his old face troubled. He gave a tiny shake of his head as if to say, "I will not blame you if you refuse." She looked at Sergeant Reilly, standing by the door. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she saw a challenge in his eyes. "What will you choose?" that look said. "Your principles or your anger?" Greta looked down at the Gestapo man, at his face twisted in agony, at the blood pooling beneath him. She thought of all the pain he had caused, all the lives he had ruined. She thought of the photographs Reilly had described, the bodies piled like wood, and then she thought of Private Henderson, of his daughters who would grow up with a father because she had chosen to save him. She thought of her oath, of the promise she had made when she became a nurse. She thought of all the tiny moments of humanity that had been built in this hospital, brick by brick, against the tide of hatred. If she let this man die, she would be no different from the monsters who had run the camps. She would be saying that some lives have value and others do not, which was exactly the poison that had created the horror in the first place. Greta took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Get him on the table," she said in German, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I will need to operate immediately if he is to survive." The American guards moved aside. The German orderlies lifted the Gestapo man onto the operating table. Greta scrubbed her hands, her movements automatic, while her mind screamed at her. Dr. Klein came to stand beside her. "Are you certain?" he murmured in German. "No," Greta admitted, "but it is the right thing to do, even if it tears me apart to do it." She operated on the Gestapo man first because his wounds were most critical. She removed the bullet from his abdomen, repaired the damaged intestine, cleaned and stitched and bandaged. Her hands were steady even as her heart raged. She saved his life not because he deserved it, but because she refused to become like him. Then she moved to the SS trooper. His chest wound was severe, lung damage similar to Henderson's. She worked with the same careful precision, giving him the same care she had given the American private. Not because they were equivalent as people, but because her humanity demanded she treat all life as sacred, even when that life had been monstrous. It took hours. When it was done, both men would likely survive. Greta stripped off her bloody gloves and walked outside into the cool evening air. She wanted to vomit. She wanted to scream. She had just saved two men who represented everything evil about the regime she had served. Sergeant Reilly followed her outside. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the darkening sky. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally. "Because if I had let them die, I would have become like them," Greta said, her voice hollow. "They chose to see some people as less than human, deserving of death. If I make that same choice, even against monsters, I am no better. Even knowing what they are, what they have done?" "Especially knowing that," Greta said. "There will be trials. There will be justice. But I am a nurse, not an executioner. If I let my anger decide who lives and who dies, I lose the only thing this war has not taken from me. My humanity." Reilly studied her face in the fading light. Something in his expression softened. "When I walked through that door 2 weeks ago, I thought all Germans were the same. That you were all part of the evil. But you—" He shook his head. "You are better than I am. Better than most people. To save your enemies. To save monsters. Because it is right. That is courage I do not know if I have." "It is not courage," Greta said bitterly. "It is just stubbornness. Refusing to let them take the last good thing from me." "No," Reilly said firmly. "It is courage. And it is hope. If people like you can choose mercy even in the darkest moments, then maybe there is a chance for this world after all." They stood together in silence as night fell, two former enemies who had found something like understanding in the ruins of a terrible war. On May 7th, 1945, word came that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the field hospital, the news was met with mixed reactions. The Americans cheered, hugging each other, some crying with relief. They would go home. They had survived. It was finally over. The Germans were silent. Their country had been defeated, utterly destroyed. Everything they had known was gone. The future was uncertain and frightening. Many wept, but not with relief. With grief and shame and fear. Greta felt numb. She should have felt something, but there was only emptiness. The war she had lived through for 6 years was over, but she could not feel joy. Too much had been lost. Too much had been destroyed. Too many had died. That evening, the Americans brought out bottles of wine they had been saving. They offered to share with the German staff in a strange, impromptu celebration. Most of the Germans declined, but Greta accepted a small glass. She and Sergeant Reilly sat outside the hospital, sipping wine and watching the sun set over the damaged town. "What will you do now?" Reilly asked. "I do not know," Greta admitted. "Continue working here until I am told to do otherwise, I suppose. After that—" She shrugged helplessly. "Who knows what becomes of German nurses after surrender?" "You will be okay," Reilly said. "I will make sure of it. I will write a statement about what you did here. about how you saved Henderson and treated all the wounded equally. That will protect you from any accusations. Why would you do that? Because it is right, and because I owe you. Henderson is alive because of you. That matters more than which uniform we wore. Greta nodded, grateful but uncertain. What will you do? Go home eventually, back to Boston. I have a job waiting, working for my uncle's construction company. We will need to rebuild just like you will. Different kind of rebuilding, but still. He paused. I think I will remember this place for the rest of my life. This strange little hospital where the war stopped for a while. So will I, Greta said softly. Over the next days, the patients were gradually evacuated. The Americans were sent back to proper hospitals, and from there eventually home. The German wounded were sent to POW camps to await processing and eventual release. Private Henderson, strong enough now to walk with help, came to say goodbye to Greta before his transport left. I will never forget you, he said, taking her hand. Never. I am going to tell my daughters about you, about the enemy who chose to be human. Be well, Greta said, squeezing his hand. Love your family. Live a good life. That is the best thanks you can give me. I will, Henderson promised. I swear I will. Thompson, the Kansas medic, shook Greta's hand gravely. You are a hell of a nurse, he said. One of the best I have seen. Do not let anyone tell you different. One by one, the Americans left. The Germans, too, were taken away, to camps and to uncertain futures. The field hospital that had been so full of life and suffering became empty and quiet. Finally, only a skeleton staff remained, Greta, Dr. Klein, one orderly, and Sergeant Reilly, waiting for his own transfer orders. His orders came on a warm May morning. He would be going back to his unit, and from there, eventually home. He found Greta in the empty ward, cleaning instruments that might never be used again. I am leaving today, he said. Greta looked up, feeling an unexpected sadness. I know. I saw the truck arrive. They stood awkwardly, two people who had become something like friends in the strangest of circumstances, neither quite sure how to say goodbye. Thank you, Reilly said finally, for everything. For saving Henderson. For showing me that enemies can be decent people. For teaching me that mercy is stronger than hate. Thank you, Greta replied, for giving me a choice instead of an order. For treating us with dignity. For helping me remember that I could still be human. Reilly held out his hand. Greta shook it, the gesture formal but warm. Good luck, Greta Hoffman, he said. Good luck, Sergeant Michael Reilly, she answered. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. I meant what I said. You are going to be okay. People like you who choose right over easy, who save lives even when it hurts. The world needs people like you. Do not let the bastards convince you otherwise. Then he was gone, walking out into the sunshine, leaving Greta standing alone in the empty hospital. Years later, long after the war had become history, Greta Hoffman would work as a nurse in a Munich hospital. She would marry, though late, to a doctor who had also served during the war. They would not have children, but they would dedicate their lives to healing, to making some small amends for the horrors their country had committed. She never forgot the field hospital in Pfaffenhofen. She never forgot Sergeant Reilly's request. Please help him. She never forgot the choice she had made, again and again, to save lives regardless of which side they fought for. When young nurses would ask her for advice, she would tell them about April 1945, about the moment when American soldiers burst through the door and she had to choose between fear and compassion. Medicine is not about politics or sides, she would say. It is about seeing the humanity in every patient. The moment you stop seeing that, you stop being a healer. She received a letter from James Henderson in 1947. He was back in Oklahoma, working as a mechanic, raising his daughters, living the ordinary life that had seemed impossible in 1945. He thanked her again, told her about his girls, included a photograph of them smiling on a sunny day. We think of you often, he wrote. You are proof that goodness exists even in the darkest places. Greta kept that letter until the day she died. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, Greta received an unexpected visitor at her small apartment in Munich. It was Michael Reilly, older and grayer, but still with those same steady brown eyes. He was visiting Germany with his wife, and he had tracked Greta down to say hello. They sat in her kitchen drinking coffee, two old people remembering when they were young and the world was at war. Did you ever regret it? Reilly asked. Saving those SS and Gestapo men? Greta considered the question. No, she said finally. It was the hardest thing I ever did, and I hated every moment of it. But it was right. If I had let them die, I would have become less than I am. The war took so much from all of us. I was determined not to let it take my soul, too. You are a remarkable woman, Greta Hoffman, Reilly said. I am just a nurse, Greta replied with a small smile. I do what nurses do. I try to heal. As Reilly left, he turned back one more time. Henderson is doing well, by the way. His daughters are grown now, with families of their own. He still tells the story about the German nurse who saved his life. Your legacy lives on. After he left, Greta sat in her kitchen for a long time, thinking about April 1945, about choices made in impossible moments, about the strange paths that lead enemies to become something like friends. And so the story of Greta Hoffman reminds us of a simple but profound truth. Humanity persists even in the darkest hours. When U.S. troops burst through the doors of that field hospital on April 28, 1945, they did not bring destruction. They brought a wounded man and a request for mercy. Please help him. Those 3 words changed everything. They gave Greta a choice instead of an order. They acknowledged her humanity even as they stood on opposite sides of history's bloodiest war. Greta chose to help, not because it was easy or safe or even fully justified. She chose it because in that moment she understood that her humanity depended not on which side she fought for, but on whether she could see the humanity in others, even enemies, even in the worst of circumstances. The field hospital in Pfaffenhofen became a small island of mercy in an ocean of hate. For a few brief weeks, the war stopped at its door, and German and American soldiers learned to see each other as men rather than monsters. It was not enough to erase the horror of the war. Nothing could do that. But it was proof that even in the midst of atrocity, individual people could choose compassion. Years later, Private James Henderson would tell his daughters about the German nurse who saved their father's life when she could have let him die. Sergeant Reilly would tell his nephews about the enemy who taught him that mercy is not weakness but the highest form of strength. And Greta would tell young nurses that the only way to survive evil is to refuse to become it, even when every instinct screams for revenge. The bar of soap, the careful stitches, the gentle hands that treated friend and foe alike, these became symbols of something larger than any individual. They became proof that we are capable of more than hate, even when hate seems like the only rational response. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that humanity can survive even the worst darkness, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are thousands of stories from World War II waiting to be told, stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, stories that remind us of what we can be when we choose compassion over cruelty, healing over harm, mercy over vengeance. These stories matter. They matter because they show us that we are not doomed to repeat the past. We can learn from it. We can choose better. We can be better. Thank you for watching, and remember, the choice to be human is always ours to make.